Hello and welcome to the next in the series of Instant Whiskey Expert. Today we're going to be looking behind the scenes at the labels on bottles specifically for Scotch whiskey. We'll take a look at some of the other ones in American whiskey and world whiskey, but today is specifically all about whiskey made in Scotland. So there are quite a few regulations out there when it comes to Scotch whiskey, and therefore whiskey falls into a few different categories. The one you're probably most familiar with is the single malt whiskey. It's one that most people talk about, drink, but obviously you've also got blended Scotch whiskey, which is super popular all the world around. So today I'm going to look at exactly what each label means so that if you get any questions at that next dinner party, because obviously you get asked a lot of questions about labeling on Scotch whiskey at dinner parties, but just in case you do humor me here, you'll know exactly what to say. So let's start with single malt whiskey. So single malt means that it is made from malted barley. Here I've got the Glenfarclas 15 whiskey, and as you'll see on the label, it is nice and clear. It specifically states single malt Scotch whiskey aged 15 years. So what does that tell us? That tells us that it is made at one distillery, in this case Glenfarclas. It also tells us that it has been made from malted barley. So that is the grain from which the whiskey ends up being made. And it says aged 15 years. So the number that you see on a bottle is the minimum amount of time it has been in an oak cask for. In this case, it could have been matured for 16 or 17 or 18 years. Most likely it will be matured for 15, but that is the absolute minimum amount of time it can be matured for. So single malt Scotch whiskey, 15 years of age. It's also going to have how much is in the bottle. So classically speaking, it'll say 700 mils or 70 cl, depending on your country. And it will also give you an ABV, or alcohol by volume. In this case, 46%. So a nice little bit of alcohol in this bottle. So single malt, definitely one that you'll probably have had before. Maybe a little bit less common, but again, something that is in the Scotch whiskey wheelhouse is a single grain whiskey. So what makes these two whiskies different? Well, a single malt whiskey is generally distilled on a pot still. So that's the classic scene you see from photos across Scotland, these beautiful golden gleaming stills. That's often a pot still. But there is a different type of distillation method used in the Scotch whiskey industry, and it is in fact the main volume provider for Scotch whiskey. So a single grain whiskey is made on a column still. Now, a column still is something that was, well, patented back in the 1820s by a man named Aeneas Coffey. He was actually an Irishman. He sold it off to the Scots, and they open-handed grabbed that invention and used it. And the difference is the way it distills. So rather than those big copper pot stills, these are really high, really tall stills, and we tend to, these days, use wheat. Sometimes you use corn, and historically we might have used corn, but generally speaking, if it says single grain in Scotland, there's a good chance it has been made from wheat. So you've got a single grain Scotch whiskey here, single grain Scotch whiskey, which means it has been made most likely on a column still, and it has been made from a different cereal. So there might be some malted barley in the makeup, but generally speaking, it will be a majority of wheat or corn, something like that. So single grain is super important because when you combine grain whiskey with malt whiskey, you end up with blended Scotch. Now, blended Scotch sales globally are probably upwards of 90% of sales for Scotch whiskey. So it is by far and away the biggest category that we find in Scotch whiskey. So if you're thinking about the big brands, okay, we've got Chivas here, things like Johnnie Walker, Grant's whiskey, those are all big blended whiskeys, Famous Grouse, stuff like that. All of those whiskeys are made using a combination of single grain and single malt. So it can come from many malt distilleries and many grain distilleries. And at their base is a majority of single grain whiskey combined with different malt whiskeys all married together. So the job of a master blender, someone who works behind the scenes at Chivas, will be to ensure that they're creating consistency in those blends. So on this label, you'll see it says blended Scotch whiskey. So that tells us if it's a blended Scotch whiskey, it is a combination of grain whiskey and malt whiskey combined together. It tells us the age. So just like on a single malt, it says that it is aged 18 years. So that is the minimum amount of time for aging. It will also tell us the alcohol by volume, so 40%. But the key thing you're looking for on a label like this is that blended Scotch whiskey to tell you that it is a combination of these two types of whiskey. Moving on, and again, a slightly smaller category, but probably one you've come across, is something like Monkey Shoulder. Now, this is a blended malt Scotch whiskey. So let's just get things even more confusing. Got a blended Scotch, combination of these two. A blended malt is a combination of lots of these ones. So a blended malt whiskey means it is whiskey made from spirit and whiskey that's been matured at many different distilleries. There isn't a minimum number. As soon as you combine two malt whiskeys together, you have a blended malt. It's not a huge category, but things like this, like Monkey Shoulder, are obviously big in the whiskey category in general in Scotland. So as you can see, blended malt Scotch whiskey, again, it's going to tell you the ABV, or the alcohol by volume, and it might give you a little bit more information as well about maybe where the whiskey came from, or if that blending house doesn't want to reveal that information, it might just give you some tasting notes and tell you a little bit about the flavor profiles you might expect in a blended malt. And then finally, there are some other categories of whiskey out there in the Scotch world. In this case, I wanted to showcase this Bunnahabhain because it specifically says cask strength. Now, what is cask strength? As I said before, all of these whiskeys have an ABV. So they have 46% or 40%, and that tells you what the alcohol by volume is in this bottle. Now, a cask strength whiskey is one which is bottled without adding any water to it. So usually when a whiskey comes out of a cask, maybe it's 55% or 50% alcohol. And the company, the distilling company, will add spring water to it and bring that alcohol down so it's at a point at which they feel, or the master blender feels, is the perfect point at which you should be drinking their whiskey. This other category of cask strength whiskies is just denoting that when it comes out of the cask, it goes from the cask into the bottle. So that means it's probably going to be a higher ABV. In this case, it's 60.1%. Woo, that's punchy. That's going to kick you a little bit, I think. So 60.1%. So that means it's literally just cask to bottle. Now, lots of people out there say that is the way a whiskey should be bottled. Why aren't more companies doing it? Well, there's a few reasons. One being cost. It's more expensive if you are simply adding whiskey into a bottle that's come directly from the cask. It costs them more because they need to, they can't bring it down or dilute it or create more volume by adding water. But generally speaking, it's because the company feels that that is too high of a strength to enjoy their whiskeys. Lots of master blenders I've spoken to over the years, when they're doing their trials, when they're blending whiskeys, they are bringing that alcohol down to maybe even 35% to actually be able to enjoy and taste all the flavors. The nice thing about a cask strength whiskey is the company is leaving it in your hands, in the consumer's hands. So if you decide to have this whiskey and you want to add 10% of water to it, you want to bring it down to 50%, well then that's your choice. If you want to drink it at 60%, also your choice, but maybe just have one. That would be my suggestion. So cask strength is definitely something else you will see on a label of a Scotch whiskey. So hopefully this has given you a little insight into some of the key categories we find in the Scotch whiskey industry, and you'll be all primed and ready for that next dinner party.